Of saying our books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And now we will say our 17 major divisions of the Bible. Before the flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, the invasion and conquering of Canaan, the Judges, the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, Judah alone, the captivity, the return from captivity, 400 years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and the letters to the Christians. So, probably most all of us are quite familiar now, especially, and probably even before this class, that before the flood was the creation and Adam and Eve in the garden, and the first sin is punishment, Cain and Abel, and the genealogies of Cain and genealogies of Adam taking us through Enoch and Methuselah all the way up to Noah. Those things in the flood were those things concerning the condition of the world and man's heart being evil continually, and God telling Noah to prepare the ark, and Noah doing that, then being in the ark for the year or so, and then coming out offering sacrifices, and God giving some new commands like capital punishment and meat given for food and things such as that, and then tracing the genealogies into our next section of the scattering of the people, where God had told them to replenish the earth, and they didn't. We know through certain leaders, especially like Nimrod, they stayed and they built the Tower of Babel, and then God confused their languages and dispersed them, and we trace those three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and saw where their different descendants went, and that he, in each of these sections, he's making certain promises, like he did in Genesis 3:15, that the coming of one through the seed of woman was going to come to bruise the head of the serpent, and so that's going to be carried on through Shem, and so we trace that in Genesis 10:11 up to a man named Abram. And so that's how Genesis 11 ends, and Genesis 12 begins, where God tells the patriarch, and that's our next section, the patriarchs, that he's to leave his country and his kindred and his father's house and go to a land that he will show them, and he'd bless him and bless those that bless him and curse them that curse them, and that through him all nations of the earth will be blessed. That's that continued promise. And so he's going to trace that promise through the patriarchs. That takes us through the end of the book of Genesis, through Esau or Isaac, and then Esau and Jacob, and then the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob's name being changed to Israel. And then we know the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors, and his brothers selling him into slavery, and them being saved because Joseph was risen to second in command. And so that's how the book of Genesis ended, and that promise was made again as Jacob gives his blessings to his 12 sons and says that through Judah, that scepter will be between his feet. He's going to be like a lion. And so we know that's that promise of the Messiah that continues to carry us into the next book, the book of Exodus. And our next section, Exodus, where a generation or Pharaoh arose that didn't know Joseph, and the people were being oppressed. They called to God for a deliverer, to be delivered. And so we know the story of Moses being put in the basket, raised in the house of Pharaoh, killing the taskmaster, going into the wilderness for 40 years, and then coming back and leading his people out of captivity, 10 plagues, across the Red Sea, and to Mount Sinai, where they are given the law. And we said that's the end of our first age, the patriarchal age, and the beginning of the Mosaic age. And we didn't mention the book of Job, but we know he would have gone in there with the patriarchs as well. So now you've got the people on their way to the promised land. They've got the law. They have the instructions for building the temple. They erect the temple, and a year after leaving, they dedicate the temple. They begin this new form of worship, and they get up to the promised land, but they refuse to go in. So they have to wander for 40 years, and that's our next section. So we've got Exodus and Leviticus with them giving the law and counting the people, getting ready to go into the promised land, but they didn't. And so they wander for 40 years. That's our next section, the wandering in the wilderness. And that's where we have the first giving of the law at the beginning of Deuteronomy, and then many of those stories of the wandering, and then Moses giving them the law the second time as they end this 40-year period and get ready to go to the promised land the second time. And that's where Moses is up on Mount Nebo, and his life ends. And the next book, Joshua, where Joshua takes over the helm and leads them into the across the Jordan. And they did circumcision. They had not been doing that. And they have Passover again. So this has been 41 years after they left Egypt. They go in and conquer first Jericho, and then Bethel and Ai, and then the kings of the north and the kings of the south. They divide the land, and Joshua charges them to be faithful, the same as Moses had done. And we're gonna be reminded again in the prophets, especially the minor prophets there towards the end, of these same principles of, if you're faithful, then I'll be faithful to you and I'll bless you. But if you're not, then you will not have the blessings. As a matter of fact, you'll have the curses. And so those blessings and curses. And so that's how the book of Joshua ends. And then we have our next section, the Judges, where there was a extended period of time where different people rose to leadership because the people would not be faithful. And just as Moses had told them, just as Joshua had told them, if they weren't faithful, then they would become oppressed. And so when they would become oppressed, then they would cry for a deliverer. God would raise up a deliverer that was called a judge, and they would be delivered for different periods of time, some 20, some 40, some 60 years. They would have peace, and then they would repeat this cycle of oppression. And so that leads us up to the next book, the book of Ruth, where in the time of the Judges, we know that there was a famine, that same cursing since they hadn't been faithful, and they fled to Moab. And you remember the story of Ruth coming back with Naomi and serving her God and being with her people. And we said that this is the second occasion, Rahab being the first there in Jericho, where God is showing that all nations of the earth will be blessed, where his ultimate goal was to save all men everywhere. And that's really where Dad's going to be going in our next quarter with this scheme of redemption. Is Christ, is God's plan to save mankind. He wanted all of us to have this relationship with him like he had with Adam and Eve at the beginning in the garden, where he's going to go and spend time with them every day in this intimate relationship. And so he's been endeavoring to do this, and man keeps breaking this covenant. And thankfully, with men like Enoch and men like Noah and men like Abraham, you've got them holding on to this covenant, and God keeping these promises through their lineage. It's going to ultimately bring us to Christ. And you've got these Gentile women like Rahab, like Ruth, that are brought in and are even going to be mentioned when we get to Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 and the genealogies of Christ, to show us that God keeps his promises, and his ultimate promise is to save all mankind. That's what his hope is. And so don't forget those little pieces, those little nuances as well. And then you've got the the time period of the kingdom, where at the end of our Judges, you've got Samuel, and then the people wanted a king, so they asked for a king, and God gives them a king in Saul, and we know Saul turns away very quickly by not fulfilling the command to wipe out the Amalekites who resisted them when they left Egypt. And so eventually God chooses someone else, a young boy named David, and he's anointed. And we remember the story of Goliath, him killing Goliath, and then eventually becoming a great warrior, and then Saul trying to kill David because of the jealousy there. And we read about that in 1 Samuel. And then we read about the continued rule of David and conquest in 2 Samuel. And we know that David wrote the majority of the Psalms. And then as the United Kingdom continued, you have Solomon. And so Solomon, you remember, also wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. And Solomon builds the temple. So you've got this culmination of God taking his people back to this place, the same mountains that had sacrifices offered on them. When you go back and look at the stories of Abram and Abraham and him going into this land of Canaan, the land of the Canaanites. But now here they're back in this land that God had promised that he would give them, and they've got this holy temple on this highest mount in this beautiful region covered in gold, showing the wonderful majesties of God. And we've gone into that at other times, and I know that's one of my wonderful subjects that I like to study is the beauty, the representation of God's holy mountain, the temple, and what that really represents spiritually. And we're a part of that today in the church, in the kingdom, and you're going to see that brought up again multiple times in this last section that we're going to look at today, having to do with the temple. And so it goes from being beautiful and covered in gold, and imagine having a place of worship that's, the coordinates are such so that when the sun rises, it goes into the entrance of your place of worship. And when I walked out the door today, when Mom was going to pick me up, and I saw how beautiful and bright and sunny it was, you know, my heart just kind of lifted, and I thought, boy, I'm so glad. It's been kind of gloomy the last few days. I've been sick for a couple of weeks, and I thought, well, what a wonderful thing, get to be a part of worshiping the saints on such a beautiful, sunshiny day, and it's bright. What a great way to start the week. Imagine when the sun came up, seeing the rays of the sun enter the temple of gold, and just everything in the pews being covered in gold, and all of this just covered in gold. Imagine the brightness and the beauty of that. Physically, that's what God was trying to show them, to reveal to them. That's spiritually, that's what he's trying to give us and illuminate us, and the most precious and fine and glorious things that we can imagine in this physical world. That's what he's trying to present to us spiritually. But we know that the people don't stay faithful, and so after Solomon, the kingdom divides, and so and it's because of their sin and Solomon's sin directly that brings in this influence of idolatry that's going to be the demise of the people. And so God begins to send in prophets. We talked about those, Elijah and Elisha and Obadiah and Joel, Jonah, and Amos. And so the kings of the north, you remember Jeroboam and his successors, are going to fall into idolatry quickly. And Jeroboam's going to put in false places of worship, false times of worship, false ways of worship, false people leading the worship. And so because of that, people like Elijah and Elisha are going to immediately try to get them to repent, and they're not going to do that. And so unfortunately, as the kingdom's going to be divided, these prophets are going to come and warn them that they're going to be carried into captivity. And so the kings of the north there's going to be 20 of the north, 20 of the south, but you remember that the northern kingdom are going to be carried away by the Assyrians. And so prophets like Jonah are going to go directly to Assyria and to Nineveh and try to get them to repent. There's going to be other nations like Babylon that are going to be growing, and so some of the prophets are going to be dealing with them. Obadiah is going to also deal with Assyria, and you've got them telling them that if Judah doesn't repent, that they're going to suffer the same demise as the northern kingdom. So after the kingdom divides and the northern kingdom is carried away or dispersed by the Assyrians, you've got just Judah alone. And so then you've got the last of the prophets, and I didn't mention Isaiah, some of the major prophets. Isaiah primarily is going to be with the divided kingdom, and then you've got Jeremiah in the time of Judah alone. And then I have to start going back and kind of saying them in my mind again to get them in the proper order. But you've got these different prophets telling them specifically, different ones, Edom, Egypt, different prophecies to tell them that they're going to suffer some type of cataclysm or justice by God. Basically, God is showing all the nations, not just Judah, but all the surrounding nations and even nations that are to come, that they're all going to be brought into judgment by God. And we're going to see that that's going to be God's ultimate plan for all of us. And that's why so many of the apocalyptic terminology that you'll see in the prophets, you'll read about in Revelation. And I noticed that again this week, especially with Zechariah. And so you have eventually the Babylonians coming and overtaking the Assyrians, we said in 612, and then in 606 beginning to conquer the nation of Judah, and then in 597 and 586, eventually carrying them away into captivity, where you're going to have prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel. Daniel dealing with the royalty, or with the kings and the lineage of the nation of Babylon, and then Ezekiel at the river Kibar with the common people. And then you have the time period where Babylon is overtaken, and then the Medo-Persians join, and then you're going to have the return to start. And so that's where we'll kind of pick up a little bit today. And I know Dad's gone into some of this already, but that's where I was, that's kind of in my mind where I had left off. And so questions or comments on that part of our overview thus far? Does it make sense in your mind? Do you see the kind of flow of the chronology? So basically, when you get to, you remember the books of history. So we said that you had the books of law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then you had the books of history, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And so if you look at those three books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, they're going to be the books that are going to be during the time of the return. So chronologically, that's where those books would be. And so if you went to the last three books of the Old Testament, Zechariah, Malachi, what's the one before Zechariah? Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So if you take those three, those books will go together. So since the books that we have, the collection, aren't necessarily in chronological order, it's good for us to know where to take those prophets and where to put those. And so you're going to have the story of Ezra kind of overlapping a little bit, and there'll be a little section there where the story of Esther will come in, but most of the dealings are going to be dealing with the people in their return back to the promised land, just as Jeremiah had prophesied for 70 years, that in 70 years they would return, and they're going to be dealing with the people, the condition of the nation and the people during this time period. So during the time of Cyrus, you remember that he was prophesied of. And so Cyrus, when he finds out about this prophecy, he sends the people back. And so we also said that this was kind of a picture of what's going to culminate in Acts chapter 2. It's going to be kind of I don't want to say a precursor, but a little glimpse of what happens in Acts chapter 2 when on the day of Pentecost, people come from all nations and come from all different areas, these Jews, to worship because they've been scattered. And they had been scattered during the time of the captivity. But when Cyrus comes to power, he allows or offers them the opportunity, if they want to come from all the places that they've been scattered to or dispersed to, they can go back to their homeland. And he's going to even pay for that, for them to have the temple rebuilt and them to go back to their nation. And he sees himself as being an instrument of God, and he was. But because they had been dispersed and because they were in different regions, they didn't all go back. The ones that didn't go back in the time of Cyrus are going to be those Jews that were left in different countries involved in synagogue worship that are going to go back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. That will also set the stage for when the church begins to be dispersed and disciples go back home after Pentecost, or especially when Paul begins to go around to the different regions and enters the cities, and he's going to go, you'll remember, either down to the river like in Philippi with Lydia, or in other regions where there is actually a synagogue. And so remember, that's kind of the start of that. And with Cyrus, you've got them going back, and there's going to be, just as there was 3 carryings away. So when Nebuchadnezzar, you remember, comes from Babylon in 606 and 597 and 586, you remember that there's 3 carryings away. And so it might get a little confusing. Well, if they're going to be there for 70 years in captivity, well, how do you count that? And either way that you begin to count that, whether from 606 to 536, you're going to have 3 different returns. And so there's going to be 70 years, no matter how you count it, from the beginning of the carryings away to the beginning of the return, or to the end of the end of the carrying away, around 587 or 586, until the end of the return to Jerusalem. You're going to have 70 years either way that you count that. But when you look at the beginning of Ezra, you see that in this first coming back under Joshua, a man named Joshua, and Zerubbabel, who was of the lineage of David. So you've got the priest and the king. You've got them coming back to the promised land, and you've got the temple in disarray. So here's this place that was beautiful and prestigious and covered in gold, and now it's just stripped bare and torn down. And you remember, each time Nebuchadnezzar came, it was more destructive. So they destroyed the walls, then they destroyed the city, then they destroyed the temple and pillage. And then you remember other nations like Edom came in behind them and even did worse damage. So that's the condition of the city and the nation under this first return. Grab a sip of water here. So, Ezra, the book of Ezra, you've got this first return that's happening. And they go and they find the city in this, in disarray. And so you can imagine the people, they're, it's probably discouraging, but their houses, they got no houses either. So they begin to go in and they start to build their houses, and they forget about their initial endeavor to rebuild the temple. And so when you begin to look at the prophets like Haggai, and in particular, you see that that's one of the things that is dealt with, is that they have come back, they start building their houses, but they're not putting things in the proper order. And so they're more concerned with their own comforts and their own well-being, and they lost sight of what their initial endeavor was. And I've made analogies to America, and in many ways, that's kind of what we did here too. When we initially crossed the ocean blue to come to America for religious freedom, to get out from under the oppression of the king, and we could breathe the word for ourselves, and we got the printing press, and we've got the access to the Bible. We came to America, and then we kind of started looking for our own comforts and building our own houses and settling the country and getting economically stable, and we kind of lost sight of some of the main purpose of us coming to have our religious freedoms. And if you think about it, America's been struggling with that ever since, having materialism and having great wealth and comforts, and we've kind of forgotten about the true height of the spiritual endeavor that our forefathers were willing to get an old crickety wooden ship and sail across the ocean and come to a hostile environment to have that freedom, and then we lose sight of it. And same with the people in the time of the return, as they came back and they began to forget what the original purpose was. And that's what you find in the book of Ezra and in the book of Haggai. And let me look and see. So if you look in the book of Ezra, it tells us that it was during the time of Cyrus and what the purpose was, and that they had certain ones of the Levites and certain ones of the priests that had come back, and there's a listing of those, and it follows them. And then when you get to they set the altar up. So, they start from the first. You think about that when you enter the temple. What's the first thing that you have? Is you have the altar. So they start the process, and so they do start the altar, and they're setting up the worship again. But again, they kind of stop along the way, and they begin to lose sight of what was most important. And that's where you're going to have the book of Haggai. He's going to come in and start dealing with that. So again, since our books aren't in chronological order, it's good for us to know where those kind of join. The book of Zechariah is a little bit, it's longer, and it has a lot of that apocalyptic literature that we mentioned, and so I had initially kind of thought about going into that maybe a little deeper than what we will today, but there are some things that I want us to bring out from that book. But that's the condition, that the situation that's happening, is you've got the people really not sure of how to do it. Think about it. Imagine if 70 years go by and you haven't really been engaged in your way of worship, or you had to do it kind of somewhere else, and you were, so you weren't offering sacrifices the same way. You're doing synagogue worship, and now you come back, and then who's leading? Who's going to take charge? How are we going to do this? And so they're trying to put the people back in order. And so you're checking everybody's lineage. Who has a right to be a priest? Who has a right to serve? When you serve, how do you serve? How do you go about it? And so Ezra is going to be instrumental in helping kind of straighten them out and reading the word of the law to them. And there's some very familiar passages that we have about Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10, where it says he prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments. And so that was his endeavor to serve the Lord himself, and then to also teach the people. So they're engaged in this process of trying to reconstruct, but they need some help in doing that. And Ezra's this scribe, so he's been writing these things. And we said that, how did these things get compiled or put together? And we know that Moses initially, he actually wrote many of these things down. And now here you've got here towards the end, and you've got this man, Ezra, and he's still writing these things. He's tracing their lineage and helping people see the history and reminding them of the laws of old. And there's others helping them trace the people and who is born of who, and who has a right to serve and who doesn't. And so there's going to be a time where the people do gather together and seek to follow that. Keep in mind that Esther is going to be back there under the Medo-Persians, under Ahasuerus, and all that's going to transpire where a plot is made with Haman to have all the Jews annihilated. And so keep in mind that that's happening in the background, where there's somebody that's seeking to completely wipe out all of the Jews. And so even though there's just this small remnant of people that's been left over from the time of the captivity and through the time of the captivity, and now here somebody still wants to have them wiped out. You remember Haman was an Agagite, from King Agag, that Saul didn't kill because he was being disobedient, and of the Amalekites that fought against him when they left Egypt. And so you see all these little inner workings of when you do what God says, then he blesses you, and when you don't, then those cursings will come upon you. And sometimes it comes in subtle ways that we don't quite realize where that connection is. We don't always make that connection in our understanding of the scriptures or in our own lives. And so God preserves the people, and you remember through Esther and Mordecai that God saved the people, and thankfully they had that new law preserved by the Medes and Persians, where they would be preserved. And so you've got now during this third return under Nehemiah, you're going to have Nehemiah that's going to come back. Zerubbabel having already come back too, and they've dedicated the temple, and they've got singers, and they've got people involved in the worship. And now Nehemiah is going to come, and the city wall is broken down. And you remember Nehemiah has this longing to help the people, and is allowed by the king to go back and given materials but at the same time, you remember that there's going to be people that are coming against Nehemiah, saying, "What are you doing here? Who gave you the right to be here?" And so, just as in the time of the captivity, where you've got the different nations around them just always trying to oppress the Jews, you're going to have them doing that even up to the very end, with Nehemiah trying to restore the city and rebuild the wall, and we know that he does do that. But you're going to have this the trouble with the people. And that's where Zechariah is also going to be in this time just before and up to the time of Nehemiah, where the people, their heart isn't really right. And so there's going to be this, there's a lot of kind of the apocalyptic literature, but there's going to be some different stories and dreams that he has that God's going to reveal to him, that's going to tell about the people and their heart and what his plans are for the people. And the people are going to be questioning God. They're going to say, why are we still having a famine here? Why is the land still desolate? Why are the people in the nations around about us still giving us such grief? And God's going to remind them that their heart still isn't in the proper condition. That's the first bell, right? Okay. So their heart still isn't in the right condition. And so God's going to remind them that they need to fully give themselves to obedience, and they need to get their marriages right. You remember they had started intermarrying with the nations roundabout and allowing that idolatrous influence to come back again. They were divorcing. They weren't taking care of their children. And so those are going to be the topics that are mainly discussed. And but there's going to be a lot of messianic prophecies as well. And so those were some of the things I wanted to make sure that we didn't forget either, is that Zechariah is going to deal with Christ and the foretelling of Christ. And so he's going to talk about his being both a king and a priest. He's going to, in chapter 6 and verse 12 and 13. In chapter 9, he's going to talk about him coming in triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem. We know that Christ does that when he comes in riding on the donkey. And in chapter 12 and verse 10, he talks about the outpouring of his Spirit upon Christ, and we know that that Spirit is going to come upon Christ and descends like a dove after he's baptized, and Christ is going to show that power over the demonic world. That's one of the things in chapter 13 where he's going to put an end to demon possession. It's going to talk about the piercing of Christ in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10, and him offering redemption of sin. Isn't that what Christ always said, even when he would perform a miracle? To show you that I have power to forgive sin, I'm going to show that I have power to let this crippled man walk or heal this disease. And so his whole purpose was to redeem mankind, and Christ is going to fulfill all those prophecies, even up to the smiting of Christ, as mentioned in chapter 13 and verse 7 of Zechariah, where where he's smitten, you remember. Smitten, hit, not smitten like Moses when he struck the rock. You remember when Moses strikes the rock the first time and water springs forth. Christ was going to be smitten. He was going to be killed one time, and the living water would spring forth. And then you remember Moses did it the second time, and that put the type in jeopardy, because Christ only died one time to offer us, to offer his life as a redemption for our sin. And so Zechariah deals with not only just those specific prophecies concerning Christ, but also eventually his kingship. And then that gets us to our final book, the book of Malachi, which is going to deal again with the pollution of the people. They still aren't following God fully in their hearts. They're questioning God. Why are we in this condition? But God's reminding them it's because of their own condition, their own hearts, that they were suffering these things. And so they were only keeping part of the law, and their worship had really they were just going through the motions, and it had become polluted and really somewhat meaningless. And so if we're not serving God fully and with our heart, soul, strength, and might, then then there's going to be something lacking. And that was the case of the people. And so the book of Malachi is going to deal with the pollution of their worship, and so basically their own personal hearts, their marriage again, their unlawful marriage, and that they were really robbing God because they were bringing their sick animals, they were bringing the maimed and the blemished, and not just the people, the priests were allowing that too. And that's going to be the same condition that you're going to find the worship when Christ comes on the scene. And Malachi is fulfilled when that one's going to come in the spirit of Elijah, the prophet, and is going to prepare the way of the coming of the Lord. We know that's how the New Testament picks up with John the Baptist preparing the way of Christ. And we know the condition of the people are still very much the same, where you remember Christ finds the temple as a den of thieves, where the priests are involved in selling the animals and trying to take advantage of the people. And so Christ, that's one of the first things that Christ does, is run the people out of the temple. So that's pretty much where we are. Questions or comments on that? All right, we may tie up some things Wednesday night, and so we'll do that, Lord willing. I love studying God's Word with you. Thank you for your attentiveness.